From Energy.Media, this is Energy Superheroes with Peter Perry. And hey, everybody, welcome to Energy Superheroes. I have on the podcast today, I'm excited to have Phil DeLuna. He's from the National Research Council of Canada, which is an organization of the government of Canada that has to do with their national research lab system. Pretty amazing. He's also given 2 TED Talks, so he's our first podcast participant that's given 2 TED Talks, or that's given any TED Talks, so that's pretty good. He's also Forbes Top 30 Under 30 and Carbon X Prize finalist, which is amazing. Phil, we're excited to have you and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So I just heard you give your power talk, which was absolutely amazing. You talk about the need to get to decarbonization or to net zero quickly. Could you just summarize for the audience? Are we going to be able to do this? Or are we totally in trouble here?
Well, I'm an optimist, and I'm a technologist, so I wouldn't be working so hard if I didn't think we could. But absolutely, yes, we can get to it. It's going to take a lot of work, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of public-private partnership and investment. And unfortunately, basically the whole thesis of the Power Talk was that in order to get to net zero, there are a whole range, almost 50% of the technologies that we need to get there are not yet commercial. They're either in the lab, or they're building prototypes, or you're making demonstrations of them. And this development cycle, which is normally about 40 to 50 years for energy technologies, needs to be sped up as much as possible. And so the whole point is we're very lucky to be living in a day where technology has advanced in terms of computing power, in terms of data, and in terms of robotics, that we can now utilize these technologies to help speed up the discovery, deployment, and impact of new clean energy technologies. So that's what we need to do.
Very cool. Just a couple of things, right? To be able to make it happen. No, but I'll hit on that word public-private partnership because that has kind of different sorts of connotations. Could you identify, say, a good public-private partnership that's been effective, and what was it that made that successful?
Yeah, I mean, well, right now we're living in a pandemic, and the number one public-private partnership I could think of is vaccine development in a pandemic. So many countries around the world have put lots of money in public-private partnerships, whether that's in vaccine discovery and development, in helping subsidize manufacturing of vaccine manufacturing facilities, whether that's the COVAX organization, which is a public-private partnership where wealthy countries donate money and vaccines to a pool that can then be dispersed to developing countries in Africa or in Southeast Asia, etc. This is just one example. The reason why I like to use the public-private partnership example of the pandemic is because there are so many parallels that we can draw to the response that we've seen to fight the pandemic, and why we need that same kind of response to now fight climate change and now look at our energy transition. When we think about energy, I mean, there are so many public-private partnerships that are happening, whether that's in Canada, for example, grants and contributions that go and work with startup companies to develop new technologies in next generation of solar cells or batteries or hydrogen, or whether it's public-private partnerships in the development of carbon capture and utilization facilities, which are massive infrastructures that require millions of dollars to do. Right in Alberta, there's the Shell Quest carbon capture plant, which captures 1 million tons of CO2 per day, and would not be possible if it wasn't for a public-private partnership in order to make that happen. So the point of public-private partnership is that the public dollars play a lot of role in the sense of helping to de-risk new technologies, in building first of a kind so that private industry can have a data set and confidence in a new technology, and in using these first of a kind plants or technologies to develop helpful regulation that will spur the markets to act. But it's only the start. We really need the private sector to then scale. The government can be there to help de-risk and be the spark, We really need the private sector and markets to make things catch fire.
Oh, that's great, and that immediately makes me think of the internet, right? Which a lot of people don't realize was initially started through the governments, and had been developed through the governments for many years before the private sector jumped in and then scaled it. So I feel that's a good example of a successful sort of public private partnership that doesn't normally get recognized. Um, I go back to the late '90s, to the .com days when things were first really taking off, and it was amazing how quickly things took hold once the private sector came on board. But of course, if you asked them to do all the infrastructure build from the beginning, it wouldn't happen. So that was an amazing example of public private partnership for sure. Um, so you talk about robotics, which I think is not usually identified by people as, let's say, an area that can benefit climate change. Could you maybe touch on how you see that coming into the fore and can help with climate change?
Absolutely. When it comes to robotics, robotics, like any other sort of platform technology, is a tool. Similar to artificial intelligence, is a tool, and there are many creative people who are looking at how we can use robotics and AI to impact climate change in a positive way. Um, I can give an example with respect to using robotics to help facilitate the discovery of these new materials or these new technologies. I'll give you an example. A Toyota Research Institute, which is an organization I worked at before in a previous life, um, they're basically using robotics and artificial intelligence to help speed up the discovery of new materials. For example, new batteries. If you want to develop a new material, you have a large search space that you have to look through of various compositions of different metals that you can mix together to make a new battery. It takes time to do this. They're using robotics to automate that process so they can test new batteries and then predict failure modes of new batteries far into the future. We can also use robotics to characterize and test things in the field. For example, the during my presentation, I gave a picture of Spot, the robot dog by Boston Dynamics. There are lots of oil and gas and energy companies who are now purchasing this robot to do routine maintenance and energy efficiency checkups throughout power plants, which helps to one increase efficiencies, lower operational costs, and provide more reliability 24 hours a day so that you can actually respond to the needs of the grid or respond to potentially downtime and hopefully use less energy to accomplish more things. And then there are people who are using robotics to create, for example, new ways to measure carbon dioxide emissions with satellites, or new ways to do self-driving robotic shipping vehicles, etc., to help with more efficient freight transportation. Uh, we're really at the beginning stages of these traditional silos of technology that are now being broken down, and inventors and innovators today, the biggest innovation is not making necessarily something new, but the combination of things to create something new.
No, that's really cool. Your thoughts about energy are super broad, I think, and cross a lot of different industries, which is rare. Did you have any mentors that helped sort of affect your thoughts about energy and get you to the place where you are now?
Absolutely, I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for the mentors in my life. A few of them, I've found that the most effective mentors are the ones who gave me the responsibility and the space to explore, who were there to support me even when I made mistakes, and who showed me how to own up to those mistakes and improve. So one of the mentors that I think have really shaped my life was my PhD supervisor during my PhD at the University of Toronto. His name is Ted Sargent. He has a massive group of 80 to 100 people, and he runs a university lab like a startup. You have deliverables. You talk in quarters. You talk about, instead of hitting this metric for sales, it's when will you get your next publication out. How do we be collaborative? How do we find out where industry wants to go? To give a Canadian analogy, you find where the puck is going, not where it is, right? And that kind of thinking and that systemic understanding of how to be ahead of the curve and how to find the connections in systems was so important to my growth. And one of the biggest things that I've learned from my mentors is time management, is prioritization, and is how to network and communicate with people, especially those who are outside of your sphere of influence or those who you may not know. Another great mentor, for example, his name is Shafiq Jaffer. He is the vice president of science and technology partnerships at Total, a massive oil and gas company. And he showed me why it's important for these large oil and gas companies to be part of the energy transition, and the smart ones who are investing in the transition now will be the ones who survive the transition and actually benefit and thrive. Going into energy, being young and naive, it's common for people to dismiss oil and gas, or to have a very us versus them view of the energy mix. But some of the best mentors, and some of the best lessons I've learned is how to live in the gray, and how technology is really living in the gray. And it should not be about us versus them, but all of us together versus the emissions.
No, that is absolutely, that's a great point, and that's really the founding principle of what we're doing here with Energy Superheroes. Is we're wanting to bring to fore the people that are making a difference, that are changing the technology and getting it to where it needs to be, in terms of bringing that thought process and those skill sets to the table to operationally change the technology, which of course is a tall order. So no, that's awesome. You mentioned skate to where the puck is going, which I think is a Wayne Gretzky quote. I love that. I'm a sports guy, and so is speaking of that. Where is a spot that maybe the puck is going that most people have blind spots to right now, that you could help sort of put in people's mind to think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of attention being put to sort of next generation fuels, or what can we not electrify? What is it? What is too big, too heavy, too cost ineffective to place a battery on? And I'll talk about two sort of technology areas that I think are really going to be key to the energy transition and are attracting a lot of investment right now, where people need to be careful and understand the fundamentals of these technologies before diving in. And that's hydrogen technologies and carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies. Hydrogen is tremendously exciting because it's a zero emission fuel. When you use it, either in a fuel cell to generate electricity or when you combust it, the only emission is water. Now, people need to be careful with hydrogen because, in fact, the biggest emissions associated with hydrogen today is how it's produced. Hydrogen is actually made from natural gas and fossil fuels today and actually emits a lot of CO2. So, what a lot of governments and private industry and technology developers are looking at is how can we make low carbon intensity hydrogen, either through electrolysis, which is splitting hydrogen using electricity and water, or through a methane pyrolysis, which is decomposing natural gas to hydrogen and carbon solid instead of CO2 gas. And so there's a lot of hype and interest in hydrogen technologies right now, along the entire supply chain of production, transportation and storage, and utilization. Whether that, so production being electrolyzers and electrolysis, transportation being infrastructure investments, and then utilization being fuel cells in trains and planes and automobiles. So we have to be careful about this because, as I said, new technology investments take time, and when investors hop in on a trend, typically they want to make a return within 2 to 3, 5 years at most. When really, again, these massive infrastructure changes are going to take years in order for return to occur. So for any investors out there, if you're going to get into the hydrogen hype train, you have to be patient and you have to realize what you're getting into and understand the fundamentals of the technology and the infrastructure that needs to be in place. I would say that that technology is about 5 to 10 years behind, maybe 5 years behind sort of electric vehicle battery technology, and maybe 10 years behind solar and wind. In, hopefully less, because we need these faster and more. But that's just to give you a sense. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage is even further away, where we have companies like Carbon Engineering and Climeworks who are capturing CO2 directly from the air and trying to make fuel from it. But this is still not necessarily economically viable. And a lot of technology advancements and fundamental science has to be done to bring these costs down. But the reason it's so important, and why this will be the future, what I'd like to call carbon capture as a service, is because despite all of our efficiencies, despite all of the electrification, we still will not get to net zero without negative emission technologies or actually removing CO2 from the atmosphere, whether that's nature based solutions or artificial based solutions. And with nature based solutions like planting trees, it takes a long time. It takes, how what you sequester 1 ton in a tree a year, when we're emitting thousands and millions of tons, thousands of millions of tons every year. So we have to think about artificial based solutions where we can actually suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. And again, there's a lot of interesting work happening here. Elon Musk recently announced, a $100 million investment for a new X Prize partnership, $100 million to find the new technology that can take CO2 from the atmosphere. So these are exciting times for these technologies. And well, whereas when people think of renewables, they think solar, wind, batteries. The next will be hydrogen and carbon capture and CO2 conversion to low carbon fuels.
Very cool. You hit that word carbon capture as a service, and I'm hearing a lot of as a service attached to the energy industry, which is very cool. I think it comes from the cloud software industry, which has grown and changed really rapidly. What are some other technologies where you see them being able to deploy it as a service to sort of defray those capital costs? And maybe talk a little more about just how that business model could work.
Yeah, absolutely. So traditionally in energy, it really is either direct to consumer or B2B, business to business, or sometimes B2G, business to government, or contract work, where what you're paying for and the sales models, you're either buying a really big machine or you're paying someone to clean something up for you on a one-off, right? And the idea of something as a service, whether that's carbon capture as a service, whether that's energy efficiency as a service, there are lots of digital apps right now that are promising efficiencies and reductions in energy consumption by using their products. The reason why these business models are so exciting is because, as we've seen in the digital realm, it's quality recurring revenue. If you build a widget and you sell that widget, then you constantly have to sell that widget, produce that widget, and it's a one-time purchase and one-time revenue generation. If you rent out that widget, or if you provide a turnkey solution and service, then now you get monthly recurring revenue. Your revenues are more stable. You don't necessarily have to worry about a contract not coming through, this or that or the other, because you already have an existing base that you're continuously growing. And that's why it's so attractive to investors and also to the growth of a business. When it comes to, for example, carbon capture as a service, the idea is providing a turnkey solution to an emitter. There are so many emitters, and they come from small to large scale sizes. Small scale size, a small microbrewery that is making a beer, or a small distillery that's making, for example, spirits and vodka and whiskey. The Whether they have a natural gas boiler or whether their process actually creates CO2, you could then presumably go to them and say, hey, for this fee per month, we will install, maintain a machine on site. We will capture the CO2. We will take it away from on site, and that will lower your CO2 carbon footprint. And in jurisdictions like Canada, where you actually have a carbon price, which will rise to $170 per ton per year for CO2. If you have a process or a plant that's emitting 10 tons of CO2, even though it's a small amount per year, and then you say, hey, I'll charge me $100 a month, then now it's cost effective to actually have that someone come on site and remove that CO2 for you. And that can scale from a small microbrewery to a massive cement plant or fertilizer plant or power plant. And so that's the exciting piece of it. And on top of that, not only are you using carbon capture as a service to reduce the footprint of a customer, but now you can think about using the carbon that you've captured and stored, and then upgrading that or utilizing that to make value added products. And now you've created a revenue stream from emission avoidance that is real, not just sort of carbon offsets that are kind of wishy-washy that you can't even really tell where they're coming from, but real carbon emission avoidance and a revenue generation opportunity from taking those carbon emissions and creating products with them. And so these are the kinds of models that I think are going to be really exciting. And I really think the next multi-billion dollar, trillion dollar unicorn will be an energy as a service company.
Interesting. Yeah, I tend to agree with that, and um, the carbon capture as a service is super interesting. And for all my free market guys that are out there, the carbon emissions are a negative externality, right? So it is a sort of a free rider problem that has existed for a long time. And I think coming up with the carbon capture as a service where you're actually capturing the carbon from the site versus, let's just say, some of the generation one things where you're sort of buying these carbon credits. I really like that concept of tying the carbon capture directly to the site itself. And I do think that there's a free market way to do it, which makes total sense. But uh, so I love the concept there. I think it's really smart. Maybe talk a little about financialization within the energy industry, because I think one of the big reasons why the as a service stuff makes so much sense is because of the ability to finance it. So if you've seen anything in that area, I would love to hear about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the short term is really drawing from the a software as a service models that already exist in tech, right? And so what I'm seeing are technology companies that are providing software as a service to the energy space to increase energy efficiency and these sorts of things. There's actually a really interesting example of a materials company called Carbon. It's a 3D printing company that does hardware as a service, where they actually almost rent out or lease equipment to a production manufacturing facility for a fee. And the data that they get from that is all hard coded and encrypted, and it's illegal for anyone to kind of modify the instrument. They have to go through the company, and this company are making complex 3D printed shapes for example, the apparel industry for shoes for Nike and Adidas, or for specific parts manufacturing in aerospace and defense. So that's a really interesting model. Now, can we port that over to energy? Absolutely. I haven't yet seen, beyond actually some examples of companies that are doing energy storage as a service, where they're actually owning the assets of, like, let's say, batteries or fuel cells on site. And Bloom Energy is an example of this. And there's a company in Canada that does this as well. I forget its name, but they do it on energy storage. That is really saying, okay, we are going to own all of the equipment, the infrastructure, all of this, and provide all of the maintenance and upgrading. But just pay us a monthly fee, and what you get is energy security. So that a data center that's based in Texas and that experiences a massive polar vortex anomaly where all of the grid shuts down, then will not have to worry about their data center or any of their operations being affected. So I think that is a really interesting opportunity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And a, a lot of people don't realize that the energy market uh, is a free market with prices for dollars per kilowatt hour and very liquid markets. So I think as the liquidity increases and we get to a place where maybe we even have a national market, within the United States, for example, I think one of the challenges we faced in Texas is you did have that ERCOT market, which was kind of a closed situation, and so it's difficult for them to import and export power throughout the world. Most of the countries have a national market, so it would be nice if maybe the U.S. could go to a model like that. I think it would be more financeable and allow us to deploy technologies in a more uniform fashion. Could
I
be
couldn't agree with
interesting.
you more. What I see, there's a few kind of barriers. You've hit on something that I'm very passionate about, which is harmonizing and increasing the energy grid throughout North America. Really, the biggest issue actually, there's two. There's a technological issue and then a political issue. The technological issue is that many of the grids were developed regionally, and for example, the Quebec grid and the New York grid, Canada and US are highly integrated, and there's energy transfer and liquidity transfer all the time. But the problem is that it's actually very difficult to transfer electricity and expensive to transfer electricity from east to west coast, for example. Whereas other countries, for example, in Europe, which are much smaller geographically, are able to have a national energy system because the distance for energy transmission is far less. In North America, the technology situation is a little bit more difficult. Then there's the political situation, which I'm sure you know in Texas, traditionally the reason why their electricity grid was separated from the rest of either the East Coast or West Coast grid in America was states' rights, was the idea of state independence, making sure that they were able to essentially have their own and have ownership over their destiny, their energy resources. And should ever, God forbid, secession be an issue, I think it was more a case back way back when America was still a young country, then they would be as secure. And the same is, sort of happen. That's the same reason why in Canada, Ontario, and Quebec, our energy grids are not exactly as integrated as they could be. So I think one, there's the investment piece of harmonizing energy grids across our nations, and then two, there's the political hurdle, which I think if people can understand the benefits in terms of resiliency, in terms of opportunity and economic security, that hopefully should subside. But I guess time will tell.
Time will tell for sure. So let's stay on the grid. I think the grid is something that people don't often think about, and just the idea that you can flip a switch and that you always have light. Um, as we transition away from fossil fuels, how do we maintain that level of resiliency that consumers have come to expect, where it's really an always-on technology or an on-demand technology?
Yeah, the key to this is energy storage, and this is so key. The reason that renewables have not penetrated markets as much as they could, despite the market potential and the market opportunity and the momentum from the market, is because they are intermittent, right? Like, what do you do when the sun does not shine? What do you do when the wind does not blow? When we're all at home at night watching Netflix because it's a pandemic, how can we expect solar electricity generation? It doesn't work. When you're living in a cold climate, a country like Canada, and it's freezing in the wintertime and it's cloudy, we can't necessarily expect to harness as much as we'd like the energy from the summer and sunny months to the winter months. So the biggest sort of hurdle that we're looking at is energy storage. And there are lots of mediums and technologies that are being explored for this. From a short-term perspective, the Tesla Powerwall, the batteries can play a scale sort of hour to hour, but they are not resilient enough to go day to day, week to week, month to month seasonal storage. Hydrogen actually is an example of a potential energy storage medium where you can use off peak renewable electricity to split water into hydrogen and then use that hydrogen as electricity generation fuel. You will, of course, lose some efficiencies because nothing is 100% efficient. But if you're using renewables, in one time of day or in one time of year, and then converting that into chemical form in the form of hydrogen, then you can recover that again because it's stable over time at another period. So the combination of electrolyzers and fuel cells for energy storage and grid stabilization is really exciting for the long term scale, and then batteries for the short term scale.
No, that's great. Another topic you hit on in your power talk was you mentioned Larry Fink and BlackRock and some of the financial companies and their investing themes and how that's changing and sort of the flow of funds. I'd love for you to talk a little more about that because it's not an area that people often think about when they think about decarbonization. They're mostly thinking about, let's say, the operational part of it, but the financial part is huge as well. So talk a little about that sort of investment theme.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find it ironic that of all of the kind of players in the financial space, it was the accountants, the most risk averse people, who were the ones who rang the alarm on climate change. And it makes the most sense, right? Accountants and insurance people are having a difficult time thinking about how do we price and amortize assets, especially assets that could have climate risk in the future. How do we provide insurance for homes that are in coastal communities that may no longer exist in 10 or 15 or 20 years? And how can we make a profit from that? And how do we reduce the risk exposure to that? And I think that the turning point was really Hurricane Katrina and the massive amount of wealth that was lost during that tragedy. And so now what's happening over time, not only are financial markets looking at this from a risk mitigation perspective in the future, but they're also seeing it as an opportunity for investment because of the signals from the government and private consumers that are demanding more ESG, environment, society, and governance action. It's really impressive as well when you think about some of the major tech companies: Apple, Microsoft, Shopify, Google, Amazon. These are companies that have very little stake in working in energy or in climate change, but they themselves have announced we will be decarbonizing our supply chains. We will be becoming net negative by this time. We will be becoming net zero by 2030, 2050, whatever it may be. Because for two reasons. One, they realize that the consumers that they're trying to reach to are demanding this more and more. Two, they realize that by doing this, they can actually become energy self-sufficient. And three, they want to be able to contribute to and benefit from this transition. These technology companies who are used to being that first adopter and riding the wave want to ride the wave of the energy transition. And financial markets are recognizing this and pouring money into it as well. A lot of it also has to deal with the fact of just of pure costs, right? I'll give you an example. In Canada, in the Alberta oil sands, this is some of the hardest energy to process. Oil that is literally embedded in coarse sand. You need a lot of processing and a lot of cost to do this. With the sort of the invention of fracking of the shale gas basins of the Permian in southern America, we saw a massive shift from America being a net importer of energy to a net exporter of energy. And now the most expensive oil in North America is from Alberta. And to actually to extract it, produce it, and then move it is not as cost effective as existing facilities or fracking facilities or natural gas facilities in Texas. And so, from an economic perspective, you're now seeing, businesses and investors, institutional investors, just saying, "Well, this is no longer a sound investment because not only are we seeing a trend away from both consumer behavior and in terms of just the worldwide energy mix and demand for oil, but now the hardest oil to process is even on and of itself at a disadvantage from an economic perspective." So we're going to continue to see this more and more as the cost of renewables and these new energy technologies continue to decrease and actually become cheaper than fossil fuel based sources. And we're going to see this as governments continue to put in regulation and policies that will promote an energy transition.
Very cool. Yeah, that's a great answer. Phil, I wish we could talk all day. You've got a lot of information that I think the audience needs to hear. I'll love to have you back on the podcast. Before we go, is there anything that I didn't ask you that the audience could learn from you that I missed?
I will say one thing that I think a lot of folks are grappling with in corporate boards, but the energy industry as a whole may not have necessarily looked at yet, is the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I know when people hear these sort of buzzwords, whether it's gender-based diversity, equity, inclusion, or whether it's race or sexual orientation, all these things, a lot of folks, especially in traditional, well-established industries, don't pay much attention to this. And the reason it's important, I'm going to give again a really broad-based, large view, and then come down is because if we think about the labor force and the way that the labor force is evolving and the markets are evolving, um, when we think about how in North America, our birth rate is below that of repopulation, meaning our birth rate is less than two, or it's around 1.9, etc. We are not making enough humans in order to grow the economy and grow our GDP. That must and will be supplemented by immigration, and as immigration continues to increase, we are going to have more skilled labor and forces from various parts of the world with different perspectives. If you want to retain and attract the best talent to make the best business, you need to have diversity, equity, inclusion, a strategy in your business. And when it comes to energy, there's no exception to this. In fact, the idea of climate security, of energy justice, while I understand there may be some people out there who may think of this as a little bit of a soft topic, it actually boils down to: will your business be able to attract and retain talent? Will you be able to capitalize on the labor market force that's coming? And will you be able to respond to the changing demographics of your nation and of your business? It's been shown time and time again that more diverse teams end up being more profitable. McKinsey did a study that showed more diverse leadership teams with more women or more racial and visible minorities were 36% more profitable than homogeneous teams. The reason being is that new and diverse perspectives lead to new ideas and more collaboration, more debate, and just more conversation. You don't know what you don't know. And so you need to bring other people in to know things that you don't. And if you have a lot of people that look like you and act like you and have come from the same places that you do, they're going to know the same things. So I kind of want to, being young, being a first generation Canadian immigrant from the Philippines, being a visible minority, this is something that I find I'm very passionate about. And so I want to advocate to all of your listeners out there that if you want to survive in the 21st century, this is something you need to be thinking seriously about. And if not from like a social perspective, think of it from a bottom line, a business perspective, because it's important.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point to end on. Certainly is an area that the energy industry can improve upon. And I do see, just in the years I've been in the industry, I see a lot of changes in that regard, changes for the better. And I'm excited to be a part of the industry and see where things will go from here. So, Phil, really appreciate your time today. This has been great. We've been with Phil DeLuna. Um, he's done a great job in articulating a broad vision for decarbonization and for the future of energy. Thanks for being with us, Phil.
Thank you so much, Peter. And everyone out there who's listening, add me on LinkedIn, reach out. I'm available anytime. I'd love to hear from you and carry this conversation forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. For more energy superheroes with Peter Perry, visit Energy.Media.